Hi, Lan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Ken.
So we're not going to do the 73 questions that we did in the last one, but that was fun though. I was wondering if we were going to do something similar to that. But
And another thing, Ken, is that the Viet Book Fest or Viet Book Fair is happening tomorrow in Santa Ana. And if you'd like to pick it up in person, the winner, then please come and I will sign it as well. So
yeah, I look
hope
forward
you make it.
to being there tomorrow. I'm bringing my kids there tomorrow. I'm going to release this episode right now, right after we're done here,
Nice.
and I'll be down there tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, so you wrote a wonderful book of poetry called Nothing Follows, and
Yes.
I have, we've just talked about this, but I've traditionally been very afraid of poetry. And the reason I'm afraid of it is because I think of like different forms of poetry in English. And when you read it, sometimes it takes so much to comprehend what and decipher what the poet is saying. And it's so complicated. And so when I picked up your book, I was like, oh my God, I was quivering in my pants. I was like, I don't know what to do with this. But when I read it, I, I connected instantly to your father's character, the way you've depicted your father. I connected with him so much.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to share that. And if you could talk a little bit about putting the book together, the collection
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And so I understand your hesitation around poetry. I think it has this reputation for being very cerebral and it's intimidating. When I talk to students, they don't have many entry points into poetry because, it's been ingrained in them that poetry has to elicit like deep philosophical thoughts. But I'm not all about that. So if one reads my poems, what I like to do is provide a story and a history of my father and my family, very specifically through images. So it's not exactly hard to access, in my opinion, because what begins and ends each poem for me is the image. Um, and but even so, I make it sound um, easy, but it was actually a 25-year process, which means I started when I was younger, much younger, and then up until today, it was hard for me to let it go. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that it becomes a labor of love and effort and because you are an artist yourself, or you speak to a lot of artists. It's basically your heart that you're giving out and you're putting out in the world. So given that, it took me a long time to also let it go. And speaking of my father, because it's about him, while I try to make very loving portraits of who he was, and I wanted to document the military person that he was and um, exalt his accomplishments. At the same time, there was a lot of abuse that I found inside the home. It was both emotional and physical. So I wanted to create a really complex person through things like a flag or through his military fatigues and the way in which he cooked for me. And so little things like that. Um, and so again, what took me so long to let it go was the fact that he is now 93 years old. He has a little bit of dementia and senility, which means he will never read the work. Um, so, on the one hand, that gave me some liberation to feel as though I could tell his story. And on the other hand, I still feel like I've betrayed him And being a traitor to the family means writing out our worst secrets and putting flesh into some of the nightmarish things that I bore witness to.
How much truth, and that's a subjective word, but I'm just trying to get as close to this idea of your truth is in the poems.
Mhm. I think so. So, with any creative work, even though it's autobiographical, there still seems to be a lot of imagination and creativity in the putting together of these images and memories. And memories themselves are not perfect. We don't recall them in their clarity. So, given that kind of poetic license, I think I was able to draw from my experiences and embellish some ideas or some images that may or may not have happened. But for the most part, it is what I witnessed, what I felt at the moments that it happened, and in reflection. Um, by the end of the book, for example, it's a more mature voice that I have assembled, and it's in three different parts. The first part is a very childlike perspective. The second, going through adolescence and rebellion, and the third section is a more self-reflective, more adult or emotionally mature point of view. And I wanted those different experiences and different perspectives to come together to see, to talk about, again, my family's history and the way in which, like, the Vietnam War had really followed us from Vietnam to Guam to Pennsylvania to finally California, and how um, the intergenerational trauma still lives on. And so that's why I took that kind of um, trajectory of time.
And the title Nothing Follows is basically the start of the journey here in the US for you, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So when we first came to the US, um, we were at Fort Indiantown Gap. And so that's a very familiar refugee story, I think. Coming from Guam, we were sponsored by a Catholic congregation to go from Fort Indiantown Gap to a small steel mining town called Butler in Pennsylvania. So when we arrived, and it was going through my archive of documents that I um, held on to for most of my life, that I saw in the documents that all of our paperwork, and we have so much paperwork, the government would send us letters to say, we've read this, we know about your appeals for family reunification, we know um, that your father was in the military, but we still have to do all these medical and criminal checks on him. So just reams of paper. And I realized that almost at every point, um, there's this phrase, nothing follows on these state documents, as if to say, we don't need any more details. And I want to, so the book gives lie to the fact that nothing follows, because in fact, everything follows in the wake of war. And so of course, the title is ironic. And I have a poem at the end of the book called "Nothing Follows," in order to talk about to finalize this portrait of my father in his older years, um, and I want to talk about, again, all the things that have followed us from Vietnam to the U.S.
Going back to that question about truth, I'm obsessed with it as I read the book because I'm kind of gauging like the reality of all the things that I experience against what you're describing and what I'm describing is very similar and it's so crystal clear the way you the efficiency of your words brings and draws in my emotions because of me reading something so similar. And that's why I really harp on the, the question of how much of it is true. So thank you for kind of explaining that. And I think for me, that's part of the reason why poetry is so difficult for somebody like me. When I'm reading it, it's like reading something that's autobiographical from you and trying to relay, like, oh my God, this is similar to me, but it's just much more descriptive. And uh, where does the truth? And so that's why it's difficult for me to kind of like concentrate and focus on understanding and following the story, because it can go so many different ways.
Right. Well, so I understand this need to get to the kernel of truth in a piece of literature. And then also in terms of this particular poetry book, it's a mixing of hybrid genres, which means I intermix the memoir and I
Hmm.
graft it onto the poetry or poetic form. This is all to say that, again, in crafting this self that I see in this book, it has to do with putting together different shards or fragments of
Yeah.
memories, different fragments of emotions in order to recreate this this world for the reader who I will lead through words and through spaces. So with poetry, the form is very particular in that I use spaces a lot, and I'm very mindful of the ways that it actually looks on the page, and how many and where the lines end and begins, and capitals, the use of Vietnamese words, the use of Vietnamese cuss words is important, and the layering of different languages, because this is what um, I know to be true, especially from my childhood. So so this is all to say that I'm not sure if asking for truth from this particular book is going to be fruitful, because um, I am the youngest of 9 children, and so what I try to do is document as accurately as possible these experiences, but they're still filtered through my own subjectivity, through my own perspective, and the world's the world that I was positioned in, again, from childhood to adulthood. So it shifts this truth or experiences. Um, but I understand the impulse to try to figure out what's true and what's not. But I'm just not sure if one does that with my book, that it will be a failure, because I can't myself know exactly what's truthful. So a famous one of my favorite writers, Maxine Hong Kingston, in Woman Warrior, has this line where she says, to you, the Chinese American person, and I'm paraphrasing, um, how do you separate out what you see in the movies and what your experiences are, or what you see in popular culture, and who you are? And I don't know if I'm a good enough writer to be able to separate out these overlapping memories and overlapping ideas about how I grew up, what kind of daughter I was going to be, what kind of person um, I saw myself as, through all these different um, parts of my life.
That's such a honest answer. Um, thank you. And it makes me, when you talked about the whole this idea of a movie, but that was my next question. The imagery and the sort of sequencing feels like shorts, and I'm not trying to like create some relative because you're a film professor at USC,
Mhm.
but as I'm reading it, I couldn't help but think about it being vignettes
Mhm.
compressed vignettes
Right.
in words, and the visualization of the words to my brain, I saw everything as short films.
Yes,
um
you
awesome
got
that way.
this, Ken. Literary analysis. Look at you. Um, just a quick note, my internet is a little unstable, so the connection's going in and out. Hopefully,
Yeah,
you can
it's
pick
fine
up.
on my end, on my
Okay.
recording end. Yeah.
Yes. So I begin with the image, I end with the image. And what that means is that for me, it works very cinematically
Hmm.
because it's like flipping through photographs, and that's the basic unit of film in any case, right?
Yeah.
And so with images in my poetry, there is movement throughout the images. And if you flip through, you'll see this movement from young girl to um, young woman. And you'll see the trajectory of the ways in which we have also moved again from Vietnam all the way to California. So that was absolutely in my mind that I wanted to be feel filmic, because I see these each poem as a portrait or an image that I wanted to capture, and so to connect them as films do, it is to create a story and a narrative about time and space.
We had a storyboard artist come on, a high level storyboard artist come on a few weeks ago, Andy Kuhn. And I was thinking about when I was reading Nothing Follows, I was like, I could just give this book to Andy and he could literally just sketch sequences of short films just from this. There's no script needed. Just give it to them. And there wouldn't even have to be words or things said. He could create a true storyline for each of the poems that you wrote into boards that could really sequentially tell a story from A to Z on each poem. It's beautiful. I thought it was a wonderful way to kind of think about for me because it's a poetry is a difficult thing for me to kind of understand, but then I was like, all right, well, let me put it in that context, and I was like, oh, this is now it makes it a lot easier for me to kind of like get through the material and see it because it's simple, and that worked for me when I visualize it that way.
Yeah, as vignettes, especially, right? Because um, each poem can work as a short story or a succession of short stories. I think that's absolutely apt, and I'm glad
Now
you picked up on that. That's what I was going for.
so that's sort of like the technical construction, the structure of it, but now I want to ask you sort of like these details like your mother. um and I don't know how much we can get into it without getting too deep into your privacy, but
Mhm.
your mother coming much later, like 2 decades later, is not a normal thing for Vietnamese diaspora families. Usually it's the father that's stayed behind in the camps or in
Mhm.
re-education camps. So it's very rare that I've heard that mothers come later or they
Mhm.
just perish in the ocean on the journey. So you don't have mothers coming typically, but having a mother come 20 years later is this one of the few cases. Can you
Mhm.
share with me like why your mother came so much later?
Yeah, no, I think.
And
Mhm.
after that, like how did that make you feel when she finally got here? And how did you have to reconcile with her presence? Because you were probably fully formed after that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I was 23, um, an angry feminist in the making. So it wasn't a great union, although so I'll go back to that later. But what happened was in 1975, because my father was in the army, he we had to leave quickly, as many military families had to do. We were part of the first wave. He had connections with the U.S. government, so we fled um, relatively in terms of a safe passage compared to other refugees who fled by boat or other more dangerous means in the successive waves of Vietnamese immigration. But so we left right before April 30th, 1975. And because it was so hurried, my mother was left behind. She was in Hue while we left from Saigon. And so this is the tricky part of memory and truth, because and I'd like to have readers think about how stories and words make meaning and make memories. So because I was left without a mother since I was 3 years old, I had to rely on pictures, the few that we had, letters to try to think about her in my imagination, um, and but then also my sister's stories. So a lot of the poems I talk about in terms of my sisters are that we fed each other stories in order to keep the memories of our country alive. And for me, more personally, to keep the memories of my mother alive in my imagination because I had no way to access her. So, um, the other part of it is that two of my other sisters were left behind too. And it gets murky as to why my mother stayed. There could be many different reasons. But I think that this is not very uncommon with other Vietnamese people in that maybe she thought that things would get better, right?
Mm.
I have a poem in the book that talks about why she stayed behind. There could be so many reasons. So that was one reason, and I think my two sisters stayed with her because they had a certain faith in the government. Um, and so she stayed behind. Another thing is that I don't think my mother liked to mother. She had 11 children. Two of them had died, one stillborn, and then one who died of illness early on. And so by the time she got to me, the youngest, um, perhaps she wasn't as attached. And I don't mean this in a critical way. I actually understand, the ambivalent feelings of motherhood. I don't buy into all those romantic notions that motherhood is natural or that you naturally love your children. There's some of that that's instinctive, but for Vietnamese culture, especially, there's this like romanticization, I think, of Vietnamese mothering. So part of me believes that perhaps she didn't want to continue mothering a whole, brood of kids. Um, and I've reconciled with that. Another part of it is that she and my father were deeply unhappy with each other, right? So when I talk about abuse, the abuse was in Vietnam. That is also what followed us from Vietnam to the US. The abuse was physical, it was reinforced by Catholic conventions that she was supposed to just bear children throughout most of her life and just bear and endure and bear um, the marriage. In my understanding or in my reading of her, and I think this is a loving reading, it's to see her as a woman during the 1930s, during French colonialism, during the war with the Americans, um, just trying to survive. And because of what I know about the history of wars on Vietnamese soil, it makes me very empathetic towards the choices that she's had to make. And so, again, I think there's many reasons as to why she stayed. On the other hand, my father also was reticent about trying to sponsor her over because he I'm not sure if they liked each other, much less loved each other. And he did it mostly out of obligation. So that 20-year span of uh, not having my mother was very impacting on me. But now that I'm older, I can see the reasons as to why both people um, would have made the choices that they made. Again, another poet that I really admire is Sharon Olds, a white woman poet who talks about this moment where her parent she imagines this moment where her parents were married, and how and what was going through their minds at the time. And I put myself at that moment just to try to reimagine what love they might have had, and then what kind of love might have remained. I just don't think um, it was a very healthy relationship for both. Um, and so, fast forward 20 years later, and I had no idea who she was when she first came. And like I said, I relied on my sisters. Um, they mothered me, and they also fed me a lot of stories about who she was, um, as a young woman, the kinds of experiences she had. She loved to gamble. She loved to play with money. She loved to just walk around. And I have a poem that calls her Bụi đời, just in the most affectionate ways, because she liked to đi lang thang, and
Oh,
just wander around. And she's atypical mother in that way. And I wanted to capture that spirit because, um, yeah, in Vietnamese literature and films, the mother is often seen as somebody who's just completely committed and devoted
mm-hmm.
and sacrificial. I just don't see that. And so part of my feminist understanding of who she was um, gave her other layers to her personhood that made sense to me, and then I was able to make sense of some of her choices.
This cultural understanding of motherhood in the Vietnamese culture,
Mm-hmm.
it's very detrimental
Mm-hmm.
because it's expected that the woman is a natural born mother and
Right.
that she's always has her antenna and her heart in the right place. And the description that you're giving, the empathy that you're giving your mother for lang thang, bụi đời, all of these adjectives are beautiful. But when I think about my experience with men who are my age, my brother, Kwa, all the people that are, there's a sort of toxicity that has come as a result of having mothers come to us prepackaged this way culturally.
Mm.
So my mother thinks that her way of being a mother is the best way, which is the traditional way, which she seems to have some sort of natural ability to behave that way, right? Or program. She thinks that and for the most part, I think she's kind of in line with that way. But now here's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We're living in America, and I'm a grown ass man, and I give no agency to my girlfriend, my wife, my ex wife, my lovers to be something that's not that. So that's put on me to expect that. And it's weird because it's a mother, it's a mother, a woman that's doing that to a man. And
Mm-hmm.
it's created all kinds of problems in my life that
Right.
I've recently began to, with the help of a lot of women in my circles,
Mm-hmm.
start to see the women who are unseen because my mom has cloaked, and I don't blame her. I have empathy for her the same way you have empathy for your mother in these
Right.
ways as well. But it's something that I wanted to call out because in the last few years I've experienced a lot of, when I think about it, like expectations I have on women. I'm like, where does this come from? And
Yeah.
now hearing you talk about this, it triggers this response about my own mother and this idea of perfection. And I
Right,
expect it with women. And it's taking me probably another 20 years to deprogram this hot mess.
right. Well, so I identify most as a feminist, and I say that so that your listeners can know that when I talk about feminism, it's not just about women or females or those who, identify as LGBTQ or non-binary, but it's also to include men. And it's like feminism is a bad word, I think, in American culture because it's seen as men hating. But really, with this kind of perspective, I can see, sorry, how gender roles are made, like constructed, and they're socially constructed, right? And so this is not natural, this is not organic. And but the ways that the gendered constructions that you witness in your family life and then outside in culture, that they have an impact in the shaping of not just women but of men. And so when you're processing that, and you're processing the ways in which you were raised to be, again, through notions of what it means to be a man, a father, a husband, a partner, a lover, that was cultivated through your parents. And so gendered expectations come into play. Your ideal, perhaps, notion of womanhood sits very closely to what your mother has done for her children and her husband. But those kinds of constructions, I hope you see, are not narratives, are not enduring narratives that you have to buy into. You could break them off. You could reconstruct them for yourself and for your kids, which I think is so important, so that they don't relearn all those ideas that we have about what is ideal femininity or ideal masculinity. So if I am raising my daughter who's to be a feminist, I also want to raise my son to
Right.
be a feminist and to understand, again, that these narratives are completely socially constructed, and that we have the power and the agency to change those narratives about who we are and how we relate to others.
I had an experience with my mom recently where gender and this cultural sort of it intersected, where we were driving and my daughter is half Taiwanese, half Vietnamese. And
Mhm.
I was saying, hey, when we get home, we're going to watch some Vietnamese videos to learn Vietnamese. And she's like, no, 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 I'm not Vietnamese. I'm Chinese.
Oh.
And then I said, well, Daddy and Banoy are Vietnamese. So, we're, Vietnamese Chinese. And she goes, no, I'm Chinese. No, I'm Chinese. And then my mother said, no, correct her. Tell her
Mhm.
you're Vietnamese first, then Chinese. And I was like, why? She's like, because you're a man and the man leads culturally.
Mhm.
And this is the thing that I caught myself, I caught her. And I said, Mom, that's not what I'm going to tell my daughter or my son. That's just wrong to do that. So, but I
Yeah.
still haven't had a way to think through this. So I would love to hear what your thoughts on how
Yeah.
to kind of like reframe this to my mom.
Wow. I think that's a really powerful moment where you realize, again, that pressure to be a certain way, and then the pressure then relates to your children. And I think you're absolutely right to push back. I'm just not sure if it's subjective. I'm not sure if it's worth the effort to reframe it to your mother who who has been ingrained with these ideas for so long, but rather to put in the effort of talking it through with your children, who will who I think would be better served
Mm.
by these kinds of discussions. I just know that, for example, my mother and my father, um, they're too old to have this whole different ideological reframing. Um, and I don't blame them because, they had really harsh upbringings, right? And so, but I think that having the instinct and the inspiration to do better for your children is um, part of the process to recognize that. For your mother, it really depends on whether or not you want to choose your battles, because our relationships to our parents are complex, sometimes very precarious, because they are almost different species, because
Yeah.
their experiences are so different from who we are. Um, and yet the ties are so strong, because I still think of myself very much as Vietnamese refugee, very tied to my family. So sorry about that. So yeah, when I then am with my parents, I have to think, what is a battle that I can win at this moment in time? And it used to be a battle about talking about anti-communism and communism. Um, and because of his experiences, we never saw eye
Mm.
to eye.
Yeah.
He always used to tell me, don't get um, caught up in those politics. And to this day, he thinks that my work, for example, is um, a celebration of Vietnamese culture, of the community, when it's not. It's very critical of the Vietnamese American community, but it's also critical of the Vietnamese state. But those kinds of nuances are so hard to translate and express. This is all to say, Ken, that um, it really is subjective as to what you want to push back on with your mom at what moment. Was it a good time? Was it good timing to, hash this out?
Well,
Um,
I want to say that my mom's very open and she is welcoming of a new way. I just didn't have the answer. And that's why I'm here asking you, like, how do I respond to this? Because I actually brought it up at a dinner party too. And
mm,
there was a white, I mean, we're all Vietnamese and there's a white woman and she was like, what's the big deal? We're a melting pot.
okay.
So, there were so many things around this thing. Before we even move on, I just want to like load up another question because I might forget it, which is I wonder what your children are thinking of, our children are thinking of us one day. Do you think that they're thinking that these people are old and they don't have paradigm shifting abilities? So that's like the second question that so I want
I,
to get say again.
oh, yeah, I know. I mean, I still, because it's so important for me to express how, um, not powerful, but how strong these figures are, my parental figures are. They shaped me, they shaped our history, and I want my kids to respect that, you know. And but they are also American, and they are living in the US. And so they're probably imbibing a lot of different ideas. And so I think it's up to us to talk through with them um, all these different contradictions, and have them think very complexly about the complexities of our upbringing, the complexities of their grandparents, and even the complexity of who we are as Vietnamese Americans. This is all to say that I believe in discussing, I believe in
Yeah.
talking. Um, we're open books at home, both Viet and I, and we talked to Ellison, for example, who's going to be 10 soon, about everything from genocide to war to Trump to, um, you know, racism. So nothing difficult is off the table. But it sounds like you don't have a contentious relationship with your mother. I just assumed you did because
Right.
I
I
have one.
don't. Yeah, I did.
But
I
it's
did in
good.
the early days, but my brother and I broke both. I mean, literally, we would not stop trying to break, like people breaking horses. I know that's not a politically correct thing to say anymore. Like we shouldn't be breaking anybody or breaking horses.
Right.
But at the same time, when my dad and mom opened their mouth and talked about Catholicism,
Hmm.
we they were trying to break us, and we it was a war. It was a war in my house, and that was the main battles were religion. Everything else they didn't care about. Academics, money. They didn't care about status. It was about everything was about ideology and religion. So
Yeah.
when it comes to this cultural and gender sort of discussions, she's very open, and she's like, well, what do you like? How should I go about what? And here I am. I'm like, well, I don't know because I don't care one way or the other. But it's an interesting thing to talk about. Do we call her Taiwanese Vietnamese or Vietnamese Taiwanese or? According to the white woman that was at the party, was like, why do you even? She even said, why do you even care? Why do you even care? Because we're all melting pot. Nobody, you shouldn't even. And yeah, here we are.
Yeah, here we are. So that kind of like liberal American perspective is woven into the fabric, the political fabric of U.S. Society. In that, every immigrant who comes here is contributing to this melting pot, and it's very reassuring, I think, to other white liberal Americans that that the U.S. is made up of immigrants or other communities, and everybody's like um, has a chance, the opportunity to succeed and make something of themselves. So that kind of idea, um, I think we have to push back against because I'm trying to figure out what your mom means by saying she's Vietnamese and that you have to assert that as the power that's vested in you because you're the male
A man. Yeah.
counterpart in your relationship. So the reason why it's important though is because, the relationship between Vietnam and China has always been vexed, right? It's
Yeah.
a 1,000-year history of colonialism. And because of that, I think that's why she wants you to assert that your daughter is Vietnamese first, although it is Taiwan and not China.
Right.
But I think in the minds of the Vietnamese and the Vietnamese diaspora, there's enough of a relationship there to say that it's um, they're they're against China in some ways. So, but another part of that is that perhaps there is a kind of ethnic discrimination going on, in from your mother's point of view, because ethnic minorities have been historically discriminated against, and with the ethnic Chinese, like our friend Ham and other people who we know, their families had to leave in the wake of the communist takeover because they were persecuted for being ethnic Chinese, for being merchants, and rather than socialist collective citizens, right? So there is an ingrained sense of discrimination, I think, that's also at play here. I'm calling out your mom in so many ways, but I'm hoping you see that it's not personal. It's more like my read of the ways in which the Vietnamese have
No, for sure.
seen
I completely
themselves
understand that. Yeah.
as the Gin majority, and everybody else is not, you know, dominant enough. Okay, so then how I would have replied to this white woman is that, there's a history of these kinds of inter-ethnic conflicts and discrimination that precedes your mom's comment about asserting your identity as Vietnamese first and everything else is second. But even so, like, for example, we call ourselves Vietnamese American, right? So the Vietnamese would be the adjective part, and the American would be the
The
subject,
first,
right?
right.
So
Never
here, I
thought
think
about
it
that.
would be
Yeah.
the same way. If you were to call yourself Vietnamese, Taiwanese, perhaps, then your mother doesn't see that the Taiwanese is the subject and the Vietnamese, even though it's first, is the descriptive. So it's the qualifier. But in any case, it's semantics, and but I'm proud that your daughter has the ability to assert her identity in the way that she articulated, and she sees herself in this way. So if it were me, I would go with however she identifies.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Wonderful.
And
That's a
and it
great answer.
could also shift. Like, for
Yeah.
example, if your daughter were to go to Vietnam, she would see herself as Vietnamese, and then they would call her Viet Kieu. And or if she were to go to Europe, she would be seen as American. So there's all these different ways in which identity is shaped by context, and not always related to a core identity that your mother seems to insist on.
Lan,
Or
that is such a wise perspective and explanation,
Mhm.
because I asked her, why do you see yourself as Chinese? And I thought that she would say, oh, my grandmother or my mom said so or whatever. But she said, no, there's just all the Chinese kids in my class. Everybody's Chinese, and I'm part of that class. And
Yeah,
it's so in South Pasadena, it's a bunch of majority are Chinese. It's ironic that, so that answer is so perfect. Your answer to me, your response to me saying, let her identify whatever she wants to identify.
yeah.
Because ultimately, why are we so married to this? But this is part of the discussion at the
Mhm.
Vietnamese podcast, is this very openness to look at different ways and different modes of identifying ourselves.
Right. And that also relates to the question of masculinity. So masculinity is not an enduring construct. Your mother implies that you have to insist on your daughter's identity because you're a man, and men are stronger. But I have to say that, if you yourself, even though you're a grown ass man, you don't feel like you have to assert that kind of authority all the time, or most of the time, or some of the time, I think you can push back by saying, that your partner is a true partner in the sense that both of you are working on shaping your children's identities, and that your identity as a person who identifies as man and masculine um, it also shifts, and things are in flux. And thank goodness, because that's emotional and intellectual growth and maturity if we don't see ourselves as not changing or evolving. So that's what I would do in both situations. Long answer to a very
No,
short.
this is beautifully drawn out. It is awesome, because I learned the last 20 minutes so much about how I should be approaching these future questions that my children, and one of my cousins asked me yesterday, why do you even do this? Like, there's no money in what you do. And I said, because I've grown so much as just a human being in the last 2 years, 2.5 years of asking questions from the brightest people in our community. And it just, just having you explain this very uh, topic, it's so simple, but I can't sit here and think about the answers going forward. But now I am armed. I hate to use that word, That is not an appropriate word, but I
Oh,
have some answers now,
tools.
some tools to do this. I look forward to seeing you and Viet tomorrow. Is there anything more that we can discuss about Nothing Follows? Other than that, everybody should go pick up a copy. And where can they pick up a copy? And where can they find links to the book?
Sure. So if you go to my website, um, you'll see a buy the book option.
Wait, can you say that again? It just cut out.
Oh, sorry. So if you go to www.langyung.com, you'll see a buy the book option, and you could buy through the website or just go to Amazon or Bookshop. Amazon is, there's a lot of books available there. I would also encourage folks to come and hear me read, because I think poetry has to also be heard. It's such an oral form, and that's where the magic happens,
Yeah.
is when you hear and you see it performed. I think that's really part of the beauty of poetry. So check out where I'll be reading. I have events coming up in San Jose, but I think the best place is the Viet Book Fest or the Viet Book Fair coming up tomorrow. It'll be a whole smorgasbord of authors who are coming to celebrate Vietnamese American literature. You'll hear from so many different voices. And, in terms of Vietnamese Americans and literature, we are kicking ass right now. And I just invite you to celebrate in the ways in which these writers, myself included, were trying to change the narrative about who we are and talk about who can speak for us and take back our stories, our images, our archives in order to put together a history and a story that belongs to us.
One last question. What you just said reminded me of a discussion I had 2 nights ago. Somebody asked me on a podcast or a recap, why is it that in a lot of the fields creatively, why is it that authors are kicking ass out there right now, Vietnamese authors, and not like why are the musicians, film, or why is it that authors are having their time and day right now?
I know. I think it's a great question. My hunch is that um, there are, writers like Viet Thanh Nguyen, Ocean Vuong, who have really um, kicked down the barriers for, I'm going to say it, a white literary elite to appreciate the art and the craft and the form of, in terms of talking about about Vietnamese people. Um, and I think it was that it took some time for that to be really cultivated. And I know that for Viet's part, what he tries to do is he also pulls other people up, right? And endorses blurbs, contributes to anthologies. In so doing, the literature is more visible, and there is all these structures in place already,
Mm.
given the fact that Asian American writers have already kind of, set this pathway for Vietnamese Americans, that have allowed us to reach a certain pinnacle when it comes to Vietnamese American literature, now being folded into an American literary canon. This is very different from Vietnamese American films or Vietnamese diasporic filmmakers who are making films. And I think about this all the time. And that is because of the economics of the film industry, right? It's much more um, expensive to make films, it's much more collaborative in US artistic cultures. There is a way in which the author or the writer, the poet, is fetishized because the individual is the most important in the ways in which we think about art. But within film, because it's collaborative, because it involves so much partnerships in terms of getting money, working with actors, working with producers. Again, it's hard to celebrate that because um, the one person which the literary elites tend to celebrate one at a time, right? Like the flavor of the month kind of thing. Um, a whole film collective is harder to celebrate. The other part of this is that Vietnamese state politics are so restrictive and repressive when it comes to Vietnamese diasporic filmmakers making the kinds of films that I think could really be impactful. Um, that they're really strangling
Mm.
their own cultural industry. And but so with, for example, Chan En Hong, Pot de Feu, it won the Cannes Award, and I'm so happy for him. But it's because he's able to make films of that caliber outside of Vietnam. So it's for many different reasons then that I think filmmakers are having a harder time getting recognized for the work that they do versus literary folks, and again, this just means that we um, as a community, we really need to support the arts in all different aspects of how we produce culture.
Lan, thank you so much. I've learned so much and I've broken down this barrier of the fear of poetry. Thanks to Nothing Follows. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Ken. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I also look forward to having other conversations with you. It's been my pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Lan. All right, see you tomorrow.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye bye.